I'm a park ranger, and in 2017 I was stationed at Kings Canyon National Park. I bunked at the Grant Grove cabins along with my coworker Tom, who was in a separate cabin nearby. One night after a long day of patrols, I was ready for bed and had just changed into my sleep clothes when I heard voices coming from outside my cabin. I listened as the voices grew louder as they got closer, but they didn't sound calm or casual. They sounded scared, high-pitched, and desperate. Seconds later, I heard a frantic knocking on my cabin door. I grabbed my flashlight and pulled on my boots, still in my sweatpants and t-shirt as I opened the door. Now in front of me were two young women, looking pale and scared. One had a jacket tied around her shoulder, and I could see blood soaking through it. She clutched her arm, wincing as her breath came through, and gasped. I didn't need to ask what was wrong, as it was clear that something terrible had just happened. I brought them inside and turned on the cabin's light. The woman with the bloody jacket collapsed onto the floor, and her friend kneeled beside her. I asked to see the wound on her shoulder, and when I did, my stomach started tying itself into knots. It looked like a bite wound, a deep one, but it wasn't shaped like some animal. When I asked them what the hell happened, one of the girls said that they'd heard someone walking behind them along the path, and then when they turned to see who it was, a naked man started running at them, tackled one of them, then sank his teeth directly into her shoulder. And he didn't let go until one of the girls kicked him right in the balls. But after rolling around in pain for a minute, the guy got up and started chasing them again. I grabbed my radio and called Tom, telling him to come over, and he was there in minutes, and he had the same reaction I did when he saw that bite pattern. I told Tom to stay with the girls and keep them safe. If whoever did that came back, he needed to protect them. I grabbed my duty belt, clipped my holster, and checked my pistol, and I then put on my ranger jacket and stepped outside into the night. I didn't know what I was walking into, but I knew those women needed our help, and all of that stuff in that moment was absolutely insane, but my mind was clear. I moved slowly through the woods. My flashlight was trying to cut through the darkness as I scanned the spaces between the trees. I had my pistol at my hand, and the safety was off, but I kept it low as I forced myself to try and breathe steady. I'd been trained for situations like this, though I'd never faced one quite so insane. A nude man was chasing women, and he'd bit one of them. None of it made any sense, but still, here I was, and I had to find him. I followed a trail near the cabins, one that led toward a meadow that the girls had ran through. Since they both come from that direction, I figured their attacker might still be out in that area. Everything in the forest was quiet. I didn't hear any voices or footsteps, and I stopped every few seconds to listen out as my flashlight was sweeping. And then I heard it. A rustle, like someone moving fast through the underbrush. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing, just branches swaying. I stepped forward. My grip was tightening on my pistol as I heard another noise to my left, closer that time. I turned and my light caught something pale moving between the trees. It was him. Those girls were correct. And he didn't have any clothing on him. And now he was running. Not towards me, but parallel, like he was almost circling me. I shouted for him to stop, but he didn't. I then tried my best to keep my light on him, but he was really fast. My flashlight bounced as I chased him, which was very disorienting. I lost sight of him for a moment, and then I saw him again, much closer than before. I called out again, ordering him to stop, and I remember how he turned with this wild look in his eyes. And before I could react, he rushed me. And my God, was he fast. A split second later, his body slammed into mine, and we both hit the ground. My flashlight was knocked out of my hand as his hands grabbed at me. I felt his breath on my face as I felt how terrifyingly strong he was. I was panicking, but I fought against it. My pistol was still in my hand. I twisted my body up, trying to free up some space for myself, but he was heavy, pinning me down with his fingers digging into my arms. Finally, I managed to pull my arm free, and the first chance I got, I fired. The shot was loud, and his body jerked the second I pulled the trigger. A groan suddenly escaped him, and I felt his grip loosen. I pushed him off and then scrambled to my feet. Then I grabbed my flashlight and pointed at him along with my gun. He was on the ground, clutching at his stomach, groaning in pain. But I felt exactly zero sympathy for him. If he died, so be it, because it'd either be him or me, I thought in that moment. I kept my pistol on him, but my hands were shaking. He wasn't moving much. He was just curled up and groaning in pain, and he didn't seem like a threat to me, but I still didn't take any chances. I radioed for help, telling dispatch where I was and what had happened. And after that, I cuffed the guy, careful not to touch his blood. He didn't fight. He was just laying there, still groaning in pain. And I just stayed put, my light and gun still on him until help eventually arrived. Other rangers and paramedics came quickly. They took him away on a stretcher while the woman with the bite wound got it treated and cleaned and bandaged. She obviously needed stitches, a lot of them too, and maybe even a rabies shot or something if the situation was really that bad. But they were safe. I went back to my cabin after it was all over. My hands were still trembling as I washed the dirt off my face, and I remember tossing my sweatpants into the trash because there was a big rip down the seat of them. Then I just sat on my bed staring at the wall, trying to process what the hell just happened, all while the forest outside went quiet again, like nothing had even happened. The man survived the gunshot. He later went to prison, charged with aggravated assault, and the women sent a letter addressed to me and Tom thanking us for saving them that day. The eventual toxicology report came back saying that guy was on a cocktail of an insane amount of crap. Obviously so. Who would do something so insane if not? But I kept that letter in my desk, though I don't read it as often as I used to. Half of a ranger's job is about protecting people, but that night tested me in a way I'd never expected. I'm glad I was there, glad I could help, but I also hope that I never have to face anything that insane ever again. Back in the day, I had this buddy named Mike. We used to drink at the same bar. Then after we got talking following a game one night, we became regular drinking partners. And Mike turned out to be a pretty solid guy, the kind that you could count on to have your back in an emergency. We'd talk about all kinds of things whenever we'd shoot the breeze over a few beers. You know the stuff, sports, work, women, news. But after a while, I realized there was this one thing about Mike that I didn't know much about: his past. I knew that he grew up in the Southwest, and I knew that he moved over to New Mexico for a while, but it hit me that I had no idea why he moved or what he did down there. It turns out he used to be a park ranger out in the desert someplace, but then, instead of talking about the job or telling me a few stories, Mike says to me, I don't really like talking about it. I didn't ask any more questions. I can't say that I was curious, but I figured that he'd talk about it when he was good and ready. We were living up near Sault Ste. Marie at the time, right next to the Canadian border, so the fact that Mike had moved across the country got me thinking. He's had all that nice dry weather down there in the south, and for some reason he'd traded it for some cold gray corner of Michigan. It was just weird, and I couldn't stop myself wondering why. But like I said, I didn't press him on it. One night, we were at our usual spot, a bar called Rusty's, where the bar top was always sticky, and the jukebox only played Springsteen and Seeger. It was getting late, and I guess I had a few too many beers because I remember my curiosity suddenly getting the better of me, and I started asking Mike about his ranger days. And his face changed. Then after a second, he said he was posted someplace dry and sandy, and then went quiet. I kept asking questions, like what the job was like and why he quit, but he shut me down quick. He said he didn't want to talk about it, and I felt this swell of regret rise in my chest. His voice wasn't mean, just firm, and I got the message. And I dropped it and never brought it up again. Now years passed, and Mike and I stayed buddies. We graduated to going to fishing on the weekends and then catching games when we could afford the tickets. He never talked about his ranger days, and I kept my word about never asking. But then one night, out of the blue, I guess he just changed his mind. We were at my place, sitting on the back porch with a couple of drinks, when Mike leaned back in his chair, lit a cigarette, and asked if I wanted to hear a ghost story. He sounded serious, but from the way he said it, I figured he was about to tell me some kind of campfire story. But in actual fact, it was the story of why he left the Park Service, and why he moved to Michigan, and why he never talked about it. Mike said it all happened back in 1990, his last year as a ranger. He was stationed down in Carlsbad National Park, a place that's all red rocks, caverns, and trails through sand. And the way he described it, Carlsbad was empty most of the time, and it was just him and a few other rangers patrolling miles upon miles of sandy nothingness. The days were hot and the nights were cold, and the work was mostly routine stuff. He'd check trails and make sure hikers didn't get lost, all while keeping an eye out for poachers or vandals. He said he liked it at first, how he didn't mind being alone, and how the desert gave him plenty of time alone with his thoughts. One day, late in the afternoon, he was out on a trail near the caverns. He was walking along on a day like any other when he suddenly saw a guy come over a ridge. The man was limping, moving slow like he was hurt. Mike's first thought was that the guy needed help, that maybe he'd twisted an ankle or gotten bit by a rattlesnake or something. So he started jogging toward him, calling out to see if he was okay. But then, when he got closer, something felt off. The guy was obviously injured in some way, but Mike said the way he was looking at him made him nervous. He wasn't looking at him in a, "oh, thank God I've found help" kind of way. It was this sort of cold stare. Mike said he once again asked the guy if he needed help, but in response, the guy pulled a pistol from the back of his pants and pointed it right at him. Of all the things Mike said he was expecting, having a gun thrust in his face was near the bottom of the list somewhere. He had his own sidearm, standard issue for rangers in case of wildlife or other trouble, but the guy had caught him off guard, and there was no time to draw. Mike said that, in a voice that sounded hard but desperate, the man told him to take off his uniform, and once he said that, Mike's mind started racing. The guy obviously wanted to disguise himself as a ranger, probably to get away from whoever was after him. The people chasing him could have been cops, but down there, I figured they could have been cartel or something as well. The guy kept the gun aimed at Mike's head and told him to take off his belt first, clearly wanting to make sure Mike was disarmed. But Mike wasn't stupid, and he knew how things would play out if he did. If he gave up his uniform, the guy wouldn't just let him walk away. A real ranger could blow the guy's cover and tell people he wasn't legitimate, so Mike figured the second that he stripped down and had his uniform taken away, he'd get a bullet in the head. The guy wasn't messing around. He said if Mike didn't take off the uniform, he'd shoot him and take it off his body. But Mike could tell that the guy didn't want to do that. Blood on the uniform would ruin the disguise and make it useless to him. Mike said he stood there, staring down the barrel of a gun with his heart pounding in his chest. He kept saying he couldn't, over and over, telling the guy he was too scared to move and that he'd have to take the uniform off himself. It was a gamble, but Mike was banking on the guy not wanting to shoot. The man started moving closer, his gun still pointed at Mike's head. Then, out of nowhere, they both heard a low rumble, like an engine coming from the hills behind the armed man. The man turned his back to look, just for a split second, but that was all Mike needed. He moved fast, ducking low and lunging at the guy. The gun went off, but the bullet missed and kicked up dust a few feet away. Mike grabbed the guy's wrist, the one holding the gun, then after a brief struggle on their feet, they ended up going to the ground. They started wrestling, rolling in the dirt with the gun still in the guy's hand. Mike was bigger and stronger, and the guy was already hurt, but he fought like a cornered animal. Mike couldn't get the gun away. The guy's grip was too strong, and as he thrashed and bucked, he kept trying to point the barrel towards Mike's stomach and chest. Mike used his weight, pinning the guy down, but he couldn't get a good swing in to knock him out. His free hand was useless for punching, the angle was wrong and awkward, and the guy kept bucking underneath him. And so Mike did the only thing he could think of. He clamped his free hand over the guy's mouth and nose and started to suffocate him. The guy's eyes went wide and panicked as he realized that he couldn't breathe. He started thrashing harder, but Mike pressed and held on. He didn't want to kill the guy, just to make him pass out so he could get his gun away and cuff him, but the guy just wouldn't stop fighting. Mike kept his hand there, pressing hard, feeling the guy trying to suck air through his palm, and then, suddenly, after almost a minute or so of doing this, he stopped. The guy's body went limp, but his eyes were still wide open and just staring up at the sky. Once he was still, Mike rolled off of him, panting, shaking from exertion, and the reality of what had just happened set in. He checked the guy's pulse. It was still there, but it was weak, and he then grabbed the guy's gun, made it safe, and then tucked it into his belt and used his radio to call for help. Not long after, another ranger showed up in a truck, which could have been the one they'd heard earlier, and they got the guy loaded up and back to the station. From there, an ambulance took him to a hospital a couple of hours away, and Mike thought that that was the end of it. But it wasn't. The guy didn't wake up. Doctors said that his brain had been starved of oxygen. He was in a coma, hooked up to machines, and his chances of coming back the same as he was before were slim. They tried to figure out who he was, and put out all kinds of calls to various agencies, but nobody claimed him. He had no ID, no family, no records, nothing. And then after a few months, the hospital pulled the plug. And just like that, the guy was gone. Mike didn't go to prison or anything, and in fact he was cleared of all wrongdoing. He said the investigation was open and shut, self-defense, pretty plain and simple. The guy had a gun, threatened to kill him, so Mike did what he had to do. But that didn't make things easier on him. He said all the cliches about taking a man's life were true, even if he knew in his heart that it was justified. He said he kept seeing the guy's face, the way his eyes looked when he realized he couldn't breathe. He hadn't meant to kill him, but he did, and so it ate at him. Mike said that he started having nightmares just a few weeks after. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, hearing the sound of that gunshot in his head. He said he felt haunted, like the guy's ghost was following him around. And sometimes at night, he'd feel like someone was even watching him, standing just outside the window of his cabin. He knew that was just his mind playing tricks, but it felt real. Too real, and that's why he quit. He couldn't stay out there, not with those memories, and so he packed up and left New Mexico and traveled as far from the desert as he possibly could without ending up in Canada. He didn't tell anybody about the move, not even his family, just buried it deep down inside of himself and tried to move on. But he said you don't move on from something like that. Well, not really. You see, it stays with you, like some splinter under the skin that you can't get out. When Mike finished his story, I remember him stubbing out his cigarette before he took a long pull from his beer. He didn't look at me. He just sort of stared out into the darkness, but there was a calm about him, like he was glad that he'd gotten it off his chest. I didn't know what to say. I mean, what the hell do you say to something like that? So I just sort of sat there, letting the silence hang in the air until Mike finally changed the subject. After that night, Mike didn't bring it up again, and I didn't either. We went back to our usual route, fishing, beers, and sports. But after he told me his story, I saw him in a different light. He was still the same Mike, quick with a joke and always ready to lend a hand, but there was a kind of darkness about him, one that I hadn't really noticed before. I guess that's what happens when you take a life, even if you don't mean to. It changes you in a way that doesn't always show on the outside. I've spent the last 25 years as a ranger at the Wind Cave National Park here in western South Dakota. Teddy Roosevelt established the place back in the early 1900s, and it's one of the first 6 national parks ever founded. But although it's more than 50 square miles of dense forest, mixed grass, prairie, and rocky hills, it takes its name from the geological phenomenon that is Wind Cave. Wind Cave is the largest of its kind in the entire world, and has more passage volume per cubic mile than any other on the planet, which, in plain English, means there are more underground tunnels under the park than any other place in the world. On top of that, only around 10% of them have been fully explored, meaning there are thousands of miles of unexplored passageways, and at the going rate, technology permitting of course, it'll take scientists and cavers more than 600 years to fully explore them. The Lakota Native Americans who made the area their home spoke of a living, breathing cave system through which their ancestors had crawled from the underworld during the first days of creation. They called the caves Washanaya, and they played an important role in the culture and creation myths of their people, who speak of Tokahei, or the first man emerging from the darkness. It sounds like classical mythological storytelling, yet the Lakota's belief that Wind Cave is a living, breathing network of tunnels is not entirely unfounded. When high pressure is higher outside the cave than inside it, air flows into the cave, raising the cave's internal pressure to match outside pressure. The process also works in the exact opposite way, meaning that in some of the larger caves, the continuous flow of air really does give the impression that the Earth itself is inhaling and exhaling. As you can imagine, such an incredible natural phenomenon attracts a lot of visitors each year, and for the most part, those visits are safe and uneventful. But one day back in 2003, what started as a fairly routine search for a missing hiker became something I'll never forget. I'd been a ranger at Wind Cave National Park for just over 3 years when the call came in. It was late in the afternoon on a chilly September day when my phone started buzzing. Its screen said Grand Teton, short for Grand Teton Interagency Dispatch Center, so I knew some kind of emergency must be unfolding. When I picked up, the dispatcher told me she'd gotten a call from a panicked hiker who said his friend had followed a child into Wind Cave and neither had come out again. Since this is still technically an open investigation, I'll refer to the missing person as Hiker M out of respect for his family. I know the internet can go crazy with amateur detectives chasing up leads, and I don't want to be the cause of an unnecessary grief to those affected. The caller, on the other hand, I'll refer to as Hiker F, so the missing hiker and his friend. The two men had been hiking down Lookout Point Trail, but when they reached Wind Cave, they saw a lone child running towards its entrance alone. At the time, the cave wasn't attended by any park staff, and since both men knew that the caves weren't a safe area to play, Hiker F claimed they'd called after the child, but the little boy hadn't responded. Concerned for the child's safety, both men ran after him, and then by the time they caught up, they saw the boy crawling into a narrow tunnel. Hiker M followed, assuring Hiker F that he'd return in just a few minutes, but apparently, he didn't come back. After some time, Hiker F followed his friend down the narrow tunnel, calling out for him as he went, but no one responded. Then, rather than risk getting himself lost down there, Hiker F ran back to the surface and then ran another 2 miles to get the cell signal to call 911. First thing I did was alert the superintendent. Then I called the park's search and rescue team and directed them toward Wind Cave. It was early evening by the time I reached the entrance, but the team had already mostly assembled, and within the hour, everyone was on site and ready to go. There were 8 of us, including 2 caving specialists who mapped parts of the cave with the Paja Sapagrado. Hiker F was there too, and he got more and more agitated as he repeated his story to us. See, the first thing Hiker F did after he exited the cave, following the brief search for Hiker M and the child he'd followed, was go looking for the kid's parents. If there was a kid running around, then his parents or teachers or whoever he was with would surely be nearby. So when Hiker F went running out of that cave hollering for help and there was no one around, he obviously got real spooked. I could understand why. I mean, what the hell was a kid doing out there all alone? We didn't have time to dwell on it, though. We geared up, our caving specialist took point, and then we entered the cave. The entrance was a tight squeeze, barely 2 feet wide, and I felt that familiar rush of cool air as we shimmied through, and the cave's breathing blew a breeze against my face. Inside, the passage opened slightly, but it was still cramped, with jagged walls and a floor that sloped unevenly. Our headlamps cut through the dark, catching flashes of the delicate blade-like rock formations that almost looked like spiderwebs frozen in stone. Our caving specialists traced the path they believed Hiker M most likely took, which took us to a low crawl space branching off the end of the main tunnel. We crawled single file as the passage narrowed even further, forcing us to belly crawl, which made our packs drag against the ceiling. After an hour, we found signs of Hiker M. A torn piece of blue fabric caught on a jagged rock, probably from the jacket he was wearing. This was obviously bad news. Not only had he gone deeper than we'd hoped, but there was a good chance that he was hurt, and if he was hurt, getting him out would be a problem. We pushed onward, following what our cavers thought was the hiker's most likely route. The cave twisted and branched, and our specialists were almost constantly checking their maps, but Hiker M's path didn't follow any known route. From what they could tell, he'd taken turns that led from the developed paths and towards more unexplored sections of the tunnel. And by midnight, we'd advanced no more than around 2 miles, and the passages were only getting tighter. My shoulders brushed the walls, and I had to tilt my head to avoid the ceiling. Before long, we'd found more signs of our missing hiker. A smudged handprint on a tunnel wall, a boot print in a patch of damp clay. Then, in a smaller chamber, I saw something that made my skin crawl. A water bottle, one we later determined belonged to Hiker M, lay half crushed in the corner of the chamber. Next to it was what we determined to be a smear of blood on the wall, fresh enough to glisten in the light of our headlamps. And that's when it became clear Hiker M was hurt, which made our search for him time critical. And we kept going, but it almost felt like the cave itself was fighting back in places. Passages narrowed to little slits, forcing us to backtrack, while one tunnel suddenly dropped off into a pit and showed to be too deep to cross without climbing gear. Another tunnel ended in a pool of dark, still water, and while I'd never actually seen it before, I knew enough about Wind Cave to know that I was looking at Calcite Lake. This was formed millions of years ago by water carving intricate passages through the earth. Calcite Lake glimmered in our headlamps because of the calcite rafts, these thin floating sheets of mineral that drift on its still surface. And around the edge of Calcite Lake is a buildup of silt, and it's that fine damp rock dust that preserved Hiker M's boot print, right there on the edge of the water. The lake isn't deep enough to drown in, not unless a person was laying down unconscious, but if that's what happened to Hiker M, we'd have found his body right there on the surface. And just like everywhere else in those tunnels, our missing hiker was nowhere to be found. Now by 3 a.m., we were exhausted, and we'd gone so deep that our radios were useless. We retreated to the surface to regroup, promising Hiker F that we'd go back for his missing friend in the morning. And maybe 6 or 7 hours later, reinforcements arrived, including a team from the NSS, the National Speleological Society. They were some of the best cavers in the entire country, paid to map out places like the Western Fringe, where reaching underground passages sometimes took days of living like moles. And we split into 3 groups, each taking a different branch from where we'd found the blood. Then within just a few short hours, we found what we suspected to be further traces of Hiker M, including a broken fingernail and another smear of blood. But even after all those cavers covered all those tunnels, we still didn't find our missing hiker. Now by day 3, we were going deeper than most tours ever went. My knees ached and my back was screaming, but I kept crawling, driven by the thought of that poor guy all alone down there in the dark. We didn't find anything that day either, but on the 4th day, we found something that stopped us cold. In a narrow chamber, barely big enough to kneel in, we saw scratches in the clay covering the rocky wall. Deep, frantic gouges like someone had clawed at the stone. One of my team shone his light on the floor, and there was a shredded glove belonging to Hiker M. There was no body, no bones, just the torn-up glove and the scratches on the wall. We reported it to the surface, and when we did, I remember how the mood shifted completely. People went from confident and hopeful that we'd get Hiker M back to the surface alive, to wondering how soon the higher-ups would just pull the plug. If a hiker gets lost, even in the tunnels under Wind Cave, finding them can actually be quite a simple process. Most know to stay put and to use flares, fires, or things in their environment to get the attention of the folks looking for them. But people who panic, people who aren't in their right minds, they tend to have real problems staying put. And it's the ones who panic that you really have to worry about, because they make mistakes, sometimes fatal ones too. That night when I got back to my cabin after the day's search, I had trouble getting to sleep. I kept picturing Hiker M, scared out of his mind down there in the dark, with his hands tearing at the rock in desperation. I prayed that he'd stay put, maybe call out a little so we could hear him, but I don't think God passed on the message, because day 5 was the worst of all. One of the volunteer cavers we had with us got stuck in a crawl space. Since he was little more than a brave hobbyist, he panicked and then started thrashing and screaming until we were able to yank him free. We got him to the surface and had a medic look him over, and he was fine, but he refused to go back in. And by day 6, we were running out of options. We'd searched every major branch and followed every lead we had, but there was still no sign of Hiker M. The NSS cavers started mapping new passages, hoping maybe they'd find a hidden chamber that Hiker M was sheltering in. But all they found were more dead ends and more empty caves. One team reported hearing what sounded like a low, breathy wheeze as they traversed sections of the tunnel, but it probably could have been the wind. The cave's breathing played tricks like that, making the wind sound like whispers or worse. In the afternoon, we made a final push past Calcite Lake, to tunnels where the walls were slick and the air felt heavy. We crawled for hours, our lights barely cutting through the darkness, and at one point, I thought I saw a shadow move just beyond my beam, but when I swung my light, there was nothing there. On the 7th day, we called it. Our superintendent was the one who made the final decision, but everyone agreed that after 7 days, with no sign of life, there was very little chance that Hiker M was still with us. We'd risked our lives, and I'd have done it all again in a heartbeat if I was told to. But in all that time, we found nothing but little scrapes and blood. Hiker M was down there. We had no doubt about that. But at that stage, we also knew that it might take months, maybe even years, before anyone was able to bring him home. I heard Hiker F broke down sobbing when he got the news that the search had been called off, and we suspected that his friend was deceased. That was a rough one on the superintendent. He just didn't know what to tell that poor guy. And when all was said and done and the search was over, I filed my report, but the question still lingered, obviously. And I kept going back to that cave for work, leading tours and checking paths, but it's really never the same for any of us. We had to upgrade security around the cave entrance to ensure that it didn't happen again, and visitor numbers took a real dive for a while. Months later, a caver found something in a remote section of the tunnel. You see, it was a single hiking boot in Hiker M's size, completely buried in clay. No blood, no other sign of the missing hiker, just that one boot. We added it to the file, but it really doesn't change much. The cave had taken him, and it obviously wasn't giving him back. I still work at Wind Cave, I still walk its trails and the tunnels underneath them, but I don't go deep anymore, not unless I have to. And when I do, I keep my light on and my eyes peeled, and I try not to think about what might be down there in the dark. For as long as I can remember, I've always had a passion for the outdoors. Growing up in Minnesota, my dad introduced me to hiking, camping, fishing, and hunting at a very early age, and would often take me on trips to Grand Portage, Pipestone, and St. Croix. But it wasn't until we visited Voyageurs National Park when I was 9 years old that I got my first good look at a U.S. park ranger. We were at a dock at the lake when suddenly, there he was, walking toward us in his starched dark green uniform and his wide-brimmed Smokey Bear hat. He had this shiny ranger's badge on his chest, and his shirt had these cool shoulder epaulets, and his utility belt was loaded up with tools for taming the wilderness. He looked ready for anything, like he could wrestle a bear one minute and then guide us through a storm the next. And when I was a kid, I was in awe. He and my dad exchanged a few words, and I hung on to every single one, picturing myself in that same uniform as I walked trails, steered boats, and rescued lost hikers. That ranger was the coolest person I'd ever seen, and the second I laid eyes on him, I thought, that's what I want to be when I grow up. The kind of ranger who knew every tree, every animal, and could make the vast, untamed wilderness feel just like home. And from that day forward, I'm not kidding, I was obsessed. I started collecting park brochures and begging my dad to have us stop by the ranger station anytime we visited a park or forest, just so I could say hi and check the place out. And that's how I got myself my very own Smokey Bear hat, and there's a photograph of me wearing it at my 11th birthday party. I looked silly with some oversized hat on my head, but I didn't care. I was the happiest kid in the world, having everyone seeing me wearing it. Since I needed a degree, I figured a good one might be environmental science, but it was volunteer seasonal work that really gave me the leg up when it came to getting hired. Working as things like park guides and visitors' assistants taught me practical skills in things like trail maintenance and water safety, so when it came to the National Park Service's ultra-competitive hiring process, I could tailor my resume to stand out from the crowd. The NPS sent me over a questionnaire which allowed me to further showcase my knowledge of park operations, and then after acing that interview, the background checks, and the physical fitness test, I finally got the call saying that I'd been accepted. It was a lifelong dream come true. I was finally a U.S. park ranger, and my first posting was none other than the Voyageurs National Park, the very same place that I'd first laid eyes on that ranger all those years before. But it wasn't always smooth sailing. About 6 months in, we had a kid almost drown after he fell in X Bay. Then we had an older hiker go missing for a few days in the fall of 1997, which gave her family and us a real scare. But then in the late summer of 1998, my fellow rangers and I went through something that none of us have ever forgotten, and that we've never been fully able to explain. It was early afternoon, and I was out on patrol near Black Bay, walking a trail that I'd walked 100 times before. I was mostly checking for signs of illegal campsites because illegal campsites usually meant poachers, but it had been a quiet and uneventful morning and I hadn't found any. Just past noon, I made my way toward a loop that'd take me back towards my ranger station. Then, as I was maybe only a quarter of a mile out, a noise came through the trees that instantly caught my attention as something that didn't belong. I used to hear all kinds of things walking those woods, but this wasn't the rustle of a deer or the snap of a branch under a bear's paw. It was a low, croaky, but very human-sounding groan, like someone was in a hell of a lot of pain. I stopped dead, my hand going for my radio, because if someone was as badly hurt as they sounded, I needed to call it in, and quick. I yelled out, asking if anyone was there. There was silence for a second, then I heard the groan again, closer that time. I moved toward it, stepping off the trail into the underbrush as I scanned the area ahead for movement. And then I saw it. I saw him. He staggered out from behind a cluster of trees, maybe 30 yards ahead of me. A man, or at least what was left of one. His clothes were shredded and were hanging from his body like rags. His skin was just this complete mess of blood and burns, blackened in some places, raw and red in others, while his face looked painful and swollen, with one eye half shut and the other wide open and bloodshot. He was wheezing and stumbling forward, then when he saw me, he let out a sound that was kind of like a half sob and half yelp. He begged me to help him, but I'm ashamed to say that for the first split second or so after I saw him, I froze. I think my brain was trying to process what I was seeing. I had seen all sorts of injuries before, hikers with broken legs, hunters who'd gone and shot themselves by accident, but this was different. The guy looked like he'd been roasted alive. I snapped out of it and ran to him just as he collapsed to the ground. His skin looked slick with blood and sweat, and he smelled like charred meat. And I knew not to touch him or try to move him, so I got on my radio and called in for help, and then tried to verbally reassure the man that help was on the way. But by then, his breathing was coming in these short, ragged gasps, and before he passed out, he muttered something about fire and how he wasn't supposed to be there. But I didn't have time to think about any of that. My only goal was getting him the help that he desperately needed. One of my fellow rangers arrived just minutes later, riding an ATV with a skid attached, a skid being a kind of wheeled gurney that you can attach to the back of an ATV. We moved our burn victim slow, and I kept talking to him and telling him to hang on, but he was already fading fast. The station was a small log building, just a couple of rooms with a radio, a first aid kit, and some basic supplies. 2 other rangers, Tom and Ellen, were there waiting for us when we arrived. Ellen's face went pale. Tom cursed under his breath and ran over to help. Tom ripped open the first aid kit, pulling out gauze, saline, anything I could use, while Ellen ran to the radio and called for an air ambulance. We did what we could for him and tried to keep him stable, but it wasn't enough. He was in agony, thrashing weakly on the table with his voice nothing more than a low, broken whimper. The guy's injuries were even worse than I'd thought. His arms were charred black in places, the skin cracked and oozing, and his chest was just cuts and burns like he'd been dragged through something sharp and hot. And I kept wondering where the hell he'd come from. There'd been no reports of a fire, no smoke in the air, and no sign of a campsite gone wrong. But here he was, looking like he'd just been immolated. The air ambulance took 40 minutes to get there, and it was the longest 40 minutes of my life. We kept working on him, trying to keep him alive, but his breathing got shallower and his movements weaker, and we could see that he was slipping away. When the paramedics finally arrived, they took one look at our burned victim and got to work, loading him onto a stretcher and rushing him to the helicopter. Then I stood there, still in shock, watching the chopper lift off into the sky. We wouldn't find out until much later, but he died in the air, somewhere over the forest, and was gone by the time they got him to the hospital. The station was quiet after that. We just sat there staring at the black marks and wet spots left behind on the table, and none of us said much because there really wasn't much to say. We'd done everything we could, but it hadn't been enough. We tried to go back to work, but what happened that afternoon seemed to just hang over us. The way that he seemed to stagger out of the woods, and the way that he sounded. The other rangers talked about it in these hushed voices, speculating about who he was and what had happened. A hiker who'd maybe gotten lost, or a drifter who'd set himself on fire. Nobody really has any true answers. The woods can always be a very dangerous place, and people get hurt out there sometimes. At least that's what we like to tell ourselves. Now, a few weeks later, our superintendent, this guy named Bill, called me into his office. He told me he'd gotten a call from a trooper with the Minnesota State Patrol. They were trying to identify our burned victim, but they kept coming up empty. No direct DNA hits, no missing person reports lined up. The guy was a ghost, a John Doe with no past. There was one lead that the trooper had, but according to Bill, it was a strange one. The boots our burned victim was wearing were old, really old, like standard issue U.S. Park Ranger boots from 1947 old. And Bill showed me a photo that the trooper had sent. They were scuffed and worn, but the design was unmistakable. I'd seen pictures of those very same boots in old training manuals, the kind Rangers used to wear way back then. The trooper didn't think that the guy was a Ranger. Nobody stays in the service 40 years without getting a new pair of boots, but he figured that he'd call to check if we knew him, or maybe if he was someone who'd worked here long ago. I didn't have any answers, and none of us did. We'd already gone through the park's records looking for anything that might connect, but no former Rangers remained unaccounted for, and no one recognized what was left of the guy's face. The boots were the only clue, and even so, they raised more questions than they answered. Bill said the trooper sounded frustrated. They'd run every test they could and checked every database, but they'd come up empty at every turn, and the burns were just another dead end. No fire had been reported in the park, or anywhere nearby for that matter, and there were no charred campsites, no scorched trees, and it was like this guy had just been burned someplace else, driven out into the woods, and then thrown from a vehicle of some kind. The coroner couldn't even say what caused the burns. He didn't think that it was a campfire, and it definitely didn't seem to be just gasoline. It was clear that the guy had been exposed to something of intense heat, but he just couldn't say what that heat was clearly from. Now, this guy was buried in a county cemetery as just another John Doe, and the park moved on like it always does. Hikers kept coming, the seasons changed, and we just kept ourselves busy with our usual duties. But obviously I couldn't let it go. I started thinking about it too much, especially at night when I was alone in that cabin. I'd lie awake, listening to the wind in the trees, and then when I'd close my eyes, I'd see him all over again. That burned, bloodied man staggering toward me through the trees and begging for help. I'd wondered where he came from and how he got so badly burned, whether it was people that did it to him or something else, like a lightning strike or something. And I started to quietly ask questions. I didn't want the other rangers thinking that I was losing it, but let's just say that I had some theories. I talked to some of the old-timers, rangers who had been around the park since the 60s, and asked if they've ever heard of anything so weird or anything that didn't add up. Most of them just shrugged. They'd heard all kinds of stories over the years, stuff about missing hikers and strange lights or noises that didn't make sense, but nothing like our burn victim who came staggering through those trees. One guy, a retired ranger named Carl, told me something that stuck with me, though. He said that the park had places where things didn't quite feel right. He'd never seen anything himself, but he'd heard stories from loggers and trappers, people who'd traveled through that area before the park was established. There were stories of people going missing or coming back different, like they'd seen something they couldn't explain. And I didn't really know what to make of that. Carl was a veteran ranger, a real no-nonsense kind of guy, so seeing him talk like that was quite something, and I started looking at the park in a new light. I'd find myself avoiding places I'd never thought twice about before, like the stretch of woods where I'd found our burn victim. It wasn't fear exactly, it was almost like his appearance felt like a warning, and it was one I was all ears to. Years went by, and I kept my thoughts to myself. But every day I thought about what happened to that poor guy, how scared he looked, how he died in agony. I left the service in 2018, then moved to a small house outside of Duluth. I thought leaving the park would help, that I'd finally let it go, but it seems to have followed me. I'd sit on my porch at night staring out into the dark, and I'd think about him, who he was, where did he come from, and what the hell left him all burned up like that. And I started doing my own research and digging into old records, anything I could find about voyagers or the land before it was a park, and I found nothing about a missing ranger and nothing about a fire that could explain the burns. But I did find other stories. As back in May of 2009, the homestead building of Death Valley's Barker Ranch just suddenly burst into flames one day. Coincidentally, Barker Ranch was the place Charlie Manson was found hiding back in the 60s after his followers went on their helter-skelter rampage, and the rangers over there at the DV National Park went to great lengths to keep the place in good shape. But then one day, the place burned down, and try as they might, but the rangers over there just couldn't figure it out. It couldn't have been a brush fire because, like I said, they kept the place from getting overgrown. Then on top of that, May isn't even nearly the hottest part of the year down there, and even when it is, things just don't burst into flames. I don't know what to believe, as I'm a former ranger and I deal in facts, but facts don't explain what I saw that day back in '98. They don't explain the boots or the burns or the way that the man looked at me like he was confused almost. I've tried to tell myself that it was just an accident, a hiker who tried to start a campfire and tragically set himself alight somehow. Or maybe he was building a meth lab, I don't know. But when I get to thinking about it, how we found no evidence of any campfire in that direct area, I start to wonder if something else did happen to him. Something we either can't explain, or we're not yet willing to face. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations.